Good morning. My name is Emanuele di Lorenzo from the Georgia Institute of Technology, and today I'd like to talk about the predictability associated with Pacific Ocean subsurface dynamics. And in particular, I would like to provide an example about attempting decadal predictions of coastal hypoxia along the US West Coast. Now, this is work mostly done by a graduate student at Georgia Tech, Mayor Pozo-Buil, and also in collaboration with Steve Bograd at NOAA. So to just dig into the problem, coastal hypoxia is the process by which coastal waters are depleted in oxygen due typically to high productivity in the coastal ocean. And this depletion in oxygen in the water column in the coast can be so critical that will lead to death of the marine ecosystem. And so sometimes these coastal hypoxia regions are also referred to as dead zones. Now, a recent study that came out in 2013 analyzed a set of observations of oxygen in the Oregon Shelf here, and this is the time series in the late 1990s to present. And they looked at oxygen content on the waters that are feeding the coastal upwelling along the California coast. And what they noted is that these kind of interannual variations were connected to changes in the gyre scale circulation in this region. And an index, a climate index that captures the changes in the gyre scale circulation is here the North Pacific Gyre Oscillation, or NPGO, and they showed that there was some correlation with this index. So this suggests that essentially changes in the circulation that are also in the subsurface may be important and drive some of these changes in oxygen. And given that the subsurface has very low frequency timescales, perhaps these type of dynamics can be exploited for predictability of hypoxia in the coastal region. So to go forward, the first question that we're going to ask is, what are the large-scale ocean dynamics that impact coastal hypoxia, and then understand the role of the circulation so that we can perhaps exploit some predictability. And so, talking about the large-scale ocean dynamic impacting coastal hypoxia, let's try to develop a simple model at the coast of oxygen variability. And so what you're seeing here is a 2D transect. This is a shelf, and this red volume here is the oxygen waters at the coast. And here you have a mixed layer and then a deep isopycnal, in this case isopycnal 26.5. And we know that along these isopycnals, these are the waters that feed the coastal upwelling, and so we have a water mass of oxygen, which I call O2 sub here in green, that essentially feeds the coastal upwelling. So if we think about developing a simple differential equation, for example, to capture the variability or the anomalies in oxygen in this red region at the coast, we can write that the variation of oxygen on the shelf are equal to a W prime term, which is the changes in the upwelling, acting on bringing essentially up this mean concentration of oxygen, which is this green volume of water. And of course, there's also some biological processes that modulate the amplitude of this upwelling. Now, while upwelling is very important in terms of changing productivity and bringing different types of oxygens water at the coast, we also know that there's another important term here, which is essentially the mean advection or the mean vertical advection or mean upwelling here, bringing anomalous water in this pool of subsurface oxygen water. So we refer to these terms as anomalies in source waters that feed the mean upwelling. And of course then, in the simple model, we also have a damping term. And please forgive me, in this simple conceptual model, the scaling of the terms is not correct, but it's just to give you a sense of the terms that we're considering. So there's been a lot of studies in trying to understand how changes in upwelling changes the local productivity and also the local oxygen content. However, in this talk, we're going to be focusing more on these anomalies in the subsurface, these O prime, and understand how they're related to the large-scale subsurface circulation of the ocean. So going back to this schematic, the goal here now is to develop a conceptual model of the large-scale dynamics of this pool of subsurface oxygen water, this green pool. So we're going to look now at a 2D view of the problem. So this is the North American coast, British Columbia, California coast. Here in this region, even though it's big, is this shelf oxygen water. And of course, these distances are not exactly, it's more like a cartoon in this case, but it's just to give you a sense. And then below the shelf, we have this pool of subsurface oxygen water. that is connected to these large-scale subsurface dynamics. And so what are these large-scale subsurface dynamics? Well, one important contribution to the pool of subsurface oxygen water is the poleward undercurrent in this region, and then of course there's a contribution from the gyre scale circulation. If we now take a map of the oxygen in the subsurface on the isopycnal 26.5 and we overimpose it here, we find that these currents essentially bring different type of oxygen waters from the gyre scale and from the poleward undercurrent. And in particular, in the poleward undercurrent is advecting low oxygen waters associated with the oxygen minimum zone, whether the gyre scale circulation is advecting waters with high oxygen content. Now, if we now change this oxygen map on this isopycnal to a nutrient map, like NO nitrate in this case, we find an inverse relationship where the low oxygen from the OMZ is also associated with high nutrient concentration, whether the high oxygen water of the gyre is associated with low nutrient concentration. And this can be explained on average by the biological processes that are in the ocean. So going back to our schematic, we now have this very distinct water masses that are contributed by the circulation from the poleward undercurrent and from the gyre scale circulation. Now, these type of water masses also have important characteristics in the temperature and salinity, or the physical tracers of the ocean. And so if we focus on this box here, which is our coastal boundary, if we like, and we look at the salinity, subsurface mean salinity distribution on isopycnal 26.5, what we find essentially that these different contributions from the extratropics and the tropics also carry important salinity signals. So for example, the low oxygen water from the OMZ has a high salinity signal, whether the high oxygen water from the gyre has a low salinity signal. So we're going to exploit these characteristic water masses to develop a model of oxygen variability at the coast. And so let's go back to our schematic and let's begin looking at some local observations. So there's been many studies of a long-term observation of oxygen in the California Current region, and these are some of them. We have from the Calcoffee program, there's 2 studies. There's also one from the Oregon Shelf from Newport, and then other studies from the California Current. And my goal is now to show that these oxygen time series that are located in the California Current can also be modeled using a physical proxy that is a salinity anomalies on the isopycnal 26.5. And the reason why I'd like to look at salinity is because the salinity, differently from oxygen, is mostly responding in the subsurface to the changes in the circulation. And so really this gives us a sense of how much of the oxygen variability can be explained by changes in the physical circulation of the ocean rather than the biological processes. And so we're going to augment these time series of oxygen with a proxy for oxygen from the ECMWF OR3 reanalysis, and this proxy is essentially built using salinity anomalies on isopycnal 26.5. But let's look at some of these observations. And so here in red, in this time series from 1950 to 2010, the first one that I'm plotting is a study from Bograd in 2008, which concluded that there was a strong oxygen trend in the California Current towards losing oxygen in the ocean. This study was followed also by another study from Newport, the Peterson 2013, which also is plotted here in orange, showing also a consistent correlation with this kind of Bograd study. There's also was another study in 2012 by Pierce that showed some additional oxygen observation of the Newport region, and they connected these orange kind of observations here in the 1960s with the one that are more modern here, and they also concluded that there was perhaps some kind of trend. Later on, there was another study by Deutsch in 2011 who showed additional oxygen observation from Calcoffee, and this kind of revealed that in the 1960s there was perhaps another low oxygen period, and so the trend was not so obvious anymore. And later on, Kozlow also published some other oxygen observation that went even way back to the 1950s, where now obviously there's no real significant trend, but rather a very strong multi-decadal low-frequency power in these oxygen fluctuations of the California cone. Now, if we now look at our salinity proxy, that is, we take the salinity anomaly on isopycnol 26.5 in the California current region, and we superimpose on these different oxygen observations, we find that this proxy actually has a fairly good scale in capturing these kind of multi-decadal low-frequency variations in the subsurface oxygen. Now, we can also look at make some kind of an ensemble mean of all the oxygen observation here in red to just make this plot a little bit more clear, and we can superimpose another oxygen proxy from a different reanalysis product, in this case the soda reanalysis, and we can see that they are all consistent with each other in showing this kind of very strong multi-decadal low-frequency variability. So armed with this salinity proxy for the subsurface, what we're going to do now is we're going to understand the dynamics of this proxy in the context of the Pacific circulation, and try to understand how it relates with the large-scale dynamics of the Pacific. And so what we're going to do now, first, we're going to take this proxy and we're going to make a correlation between this salinity proxy and the salinity on isopycnol 26.5, all in the Northeast Pacific region. So this is correlation here, and you see strong correlation from minus 0.8 to 0.8. So the proxy is defined in this region here in the shelf. So this blue line is essentially the mean, the average salinity anomaly in this region here on the isopycnol 26.5, and so you see in fact high correlation in this region, and then you see that the correlation kind of extends a little bit everywhere, and then there's some kind of anti-correlation in the gyre here. Now, before going any forward, I want to confirm a little bit more whether this is a good proxy for oxygen. And so this particular dot here in the middle of the domain is station P, and at this station we have long-term observations of oxygen from the Canadian DFO, or Fishery and Ocean Department. And so these are plotted here in red, and for this same point I also plot the salinity anomaly, which is my proxy for oxygen, and you can see that they are indeed strongly correlated. So I have some confidence that this salinity proxy is actually doing a good job in capturing the oxygen content. So going back to our map, again, this is the correlation of our ECMWF salinity proxy with salinity everywhere. And the question that we're going to ask now is, where did these anomalies that we see here in the coastal region come from? And so what we're going to do is we're going to do a little movie where we're going to take our time series of the oxygen proxy in the California current and correlate it with these salinity anomalies at different times backward in time. Sorry for my English here. So this is correlation at year 0, and this is correlation 1 year prior, 2 year prior, 3 year prior, 4 year priors, 5 year priors, 6 year priors, 7 years priors, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So if we go backward in time, what you have seen is that these anomalies appear to come down the gyre. In fact, let me just forward this movie now forward in time and check this anomaly here in the gyre in the North Pacific current coming downstream in the California current. So this is the forward movie again, and this is the backward movie. You can see that they're coming down the gyre. So if this is the case, then one could think that if I want to predict what the oxygen anomaly are going to be in this blue region here of the California coast, maybe I can do a simple prediction model where I sample and look at the anomalies in upstream of the gyre in the North Pacific current where this red box is. So let's do that exercise. And so first let me plot again the salinity anomaly or the oxygen proxy for the California current here in blue. And so this is this blue proxy here. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to try to forecast this particular variations of oxygen in this region using essentially an index of salinity anomaly in the upstream of the gyre in this red box. So I'm going to make essentially a time series of salinity anomaly here in this red box here in the North Pacific current, and then I'm going to use these to forecast 12 years later what's going on here in the California coast. And so let's do that exercise. And so this is the oxygen index in the gyre, which I use to forecast in red. And what you can see is that there is some degree of correlation. Of course, from a statistical standpoint, this correlation is not significant. We are talking about 0.55 correlation. But it's really interesting to see that there are these low frequency fluctuations that seem to correspond, as pointed out also from this from the lead lag correlation maps, suggesting that in fact, this period of rising oxygen levels is going to be followed by a period of low oxygen level, like towards another period of strong hypoxia. And whether this is true or not, of course, needs to be seen. But perhaps this sets the basis to explore how effective can be, understanding these subsurface dynamics to predict, coastal hypoxia in particular region, like the California coast. So just to conclude then, I have a couple comments and challenges. The first comment then is that the strong decadal variability in the subsurface, in the circulation, may be exploited for decadal predictions of ecosystem changes in upwelling regions, such as the California current, for example, but also perhaps in tropical upwelling and other upwelling regions. And of course, the second one is that we need to do more research to constrain the subsurface dynamics and understand the potential for predictability. And this is an exercise that must be done probably by combining models and observations. So this particular kind of study that I just showed today is more of a teaser rather than a conclusive study, but it is suggestive that perhaps there is some predictability power in looking at anomalies in the subsurface and tracking them along the gyre. So this is all I have to say for this talk, and I think if there's any questions, this would be the time. Thank you very much.